to you. It's a nice day, and we're more or less back to normal in the house. There's some bits and bobs to do, but there we are. Well, we're just past Easter, the weekend when Christ was crucified and rose again, and that's the basis of our faith. It's a vastly important weekend. We are moving on to the book of Exodus today. You may hear some banging and building works because next door are having a new front door. So there we are. Hi Liam. But we're going to get on with Exodus. Now the story of Exodus is the story of 2 million slaves. It's actually about 2.5 million slaves escaping the most highly fortified nation in the whole world, or in the known world. It's the greatest escape story I think ever. It's a miracle. Actually, it's a series of miracles. Moses saw more miracles than Abraham, Isaac and Jacob put together. It's a string of supernatural interventions on behalf of God's people. Some of these miracles sound like magic, like Moses turning the stick into a snake and then back again. With most of the miracles, God is manipulating his own creation for the sake of his nationalist goals for the good of his people. This event had national significance for the people of Israel. This was the beginning of their national story. This is when they got their political freedom. And this is the first time that they were actually a sovereign nation in their own right. And though they didn't have a land, they were now a people, a nation with their own name, the name the Israelites. And forever afterwards, they've celebrated this event once a year. They hold their Passover to the extent much as the Americans celebrate July the 4th. And we don't doubt now why they do. But this has a spiritual significance as well. And this was when they discovered that their God was the God who made the whole universe. And therefore he could control what he made for their sake. They came to believe that their God was greater than any other God, especially the God of Egypt, the gods of Egypt, all put together. Ultimately, they would realize that their God was the only God that existed. And Isaiah keeps on emphasizing that. He said, there is no other God besides me, which is Isaiah speaking out the words of God. But at this stage, they were to discover that their God was more powerful than every other God, that he was the supreme God. It's here that God also gives himself a title, El Shaddai, God Almighty. and it's in Exodus that we are given God's name. And it's when you discover a person's name that a relationship can start and flourish. So here, God has a name as well as many, many titles, and his name is Yahweh. The creator of everything became the redeemer of a few people. And it's that aspect of creator. Hi, Sharon. It's that aspect of creator and redeemer that we have always put together. Some think of him as one or the other, but they firmly go together. He's creator and redeemer. Now, this is one of 5 books that books of Moses. 4 books are much the same, but one book is set apart. Genesis stands alone. Genesis, as we've just gone through, is the only book in its entirety about the times before Moses was alive. And all of the rest of the books that he wrote were about things that happened during his lifetime. These were a bunch of slaves who had been 400 years in slavery, who were without their own land or their own money or without anything else really. They needed to be told their roots in Genesis. And the 4 other books are a mixture of narrative and legislation. So part of it he's telling the story, part of it he's talking about what they need to do. Moses had to write the previous history of these slaves so that they knew their roots. They knew where they had come from. So Moses collected 2 things from people, and these were stories. Their genealogies and the stories of their ancestors. So Genesis is entirely made up of these stories, and you remember that at this time fictional stories weren't around, because they had to remember their ancestry, they had to remember their where they came from and what their people had done. So these are the stories that they told around the campfire. These days we've got lots of fictional books and lots of sci-fi fiction and what have you. There was nothing of that nature. They had enough to do with keeping up with the genealogies and the stories of their ancestors, and these would be passed down from father to son around the campfire in the evenings. So Genesis is entirely made up of these stories, but with Exodus, Moses begins his own life story. And Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy and Numbers are a mixture of narrative and legislation of what happened in their history and what God said to them by way of how they should live. And it's a unique narrative and legislation, and the character and that characterizes the 4 other books of Moses. And the book of Moses is typical. Chapters 1 to 18, the first half of Exodus is what God did on their behalf by way of miracles, to get them out of slavery, and that's a narrative. It's the first half demonstrates God's good grace towards them and his free favor by getting them out of their problems. And chapter 19 to 40, the second half, is what he said. It's the legislation and how they were to live now that they were free. And these are divine words of gratitude. And therefore the second half is an expectation of gratitude for that grace by living, by following God's law. So we've got redemption in the first half and righteousness in the second half. They were set free first, or redeemed, and then given the law to keep by gratitude. It's not the other way around, which a lot of people think. You are redeemed first and then you live right. And that's exactly the same way in the New Testament also. You are redeemed and then you live holy lives. You don't become a Christian by living a holy life, first off. And this is a major problem for that I see with many Christians. They expect people to start living right before they have accepted Christ, and they almost hold back on introducing people to Christ before they've started living right. The whole aspect of Christianity is that you introduce people to Christ first of all, and then Christ starts changing them dependent on their relationship. You are liberated from your sin and then you start to live right. So in chapters 1 to 18 they are liberated from Egypt, and in chapters 19 to 40 they undergo the legislation at Sinai. Then they go through a marriage ceremony with God. God says, I will, and then the people respond with, I will. And it's called a marriage. They have the honeymoon, and then they start to live in the land that God's chosen. They are set free from slavery, but not so that they can do anything that they like. They are set free from slavery, but for service. Just as we are in the New Testament, we are set free from our sins to serve God. So redemption comes before righteousness, and the book of Exodus makes that completely clear. God redeems them first and says, now live right, because I've set you free. There are 6 sections in up to chapter 18, and 4 sections between chapters 19 and 40. The 6 sections up to chapter 18 are multiplication and murder. This is the Israelites, and this covers the incredible increase in the number of Hebrew slaves over 400 years, and they moved from one family to 2.5 million people. And if you're thinking that's an extreme number, it only takes 4 children in each generation over 30 generations to make that number, which is not a lot. The second part is bulrushes and the bush, and you all know the story of Moses. So he was taken out of the bulrushes and given the name Moshe, which is drawn out, and all the other baby boys were thrown into the Nile to the crocodiles. Then we have plague and pestilence. This focuses on Pharaoh and the hardness of his heart. Feast and firstborn, the origin of the Passover. Delivered and drowned, crossing of the Red Sea. And provided and protected, talks about their journey from Egypt to Sinai. And this is about God providing and protecting them in the wilderness, where the Egyptian army was perishing after 3 days. And then if we go to chapters 19 to 40, you have first the commandments and the covenants. These were sealed in a covenant, a marriage between God and his people. Specification and specialists, the fact that God is now going to live amongst them, and therefore he needs a place to live, and he needs a tent, but one very different from theirs. So we have here the specifications for the tabernacle, and God provides the specialists to complete the task. People who have never made anything other than bricks up until now are given the skills by the Holy Spirit, and these are skills to work with gold, silver and wood. And then we go to indulgence and intercession. The golden calf they indulged themselves with, and Moses praying earnestly for God to spare the majority of the people. And then construction and consecration, the completion of the tabernacle, and God takes residence and the glory comes down on the tabernacle. In Hebrew, this book is called These Are the Names. It's read each year from a scroll, and the name of the book comes from the first few words on the scroll. When it's translated into Greek, they used two Greek words, ex, which means out, and hodos, which means way. You could potentially have seen these words in a Greek theatre where you've got the exit, or in Latin it's exodos, which means way out. And we've sort of manipulated it a little bit for English reading to Exodus. This is a completely unnatural story, and many people ask, did this really happen? There is no record of these happenings in any other form other than the Bible, and this is why people wonder whether it's a myth or a miracle. Why are there these problems with it? There's no secular record, as I've said, of these events outside the Bible. The Egyptians kept pretty good records, but can you imagine the disgrace, the humiliation, if the Egyptians had kept a record of 2,500 slaves just walking out of Egypt, and then on top of that they had their best chariots and best charioteers drown in the Red Sea? I doubt very much if the Egyptians would have written that down, and even if they did write it down, it probably would have been destroyed and wiped out of their history. The numbers involved create another problem for other people. Over 2.5 million people. If they walked 5 abreast, it would go on for 110 miles, which is a long train. To say nothing of the animals, and to say nothing of the fact that some Egyptians came with them. This figure is staggering. And there are lots of theories. There are theories about that it wasn't 2.5 million people. The scholars who've translated the Bible have got it wrong. and it was more like 50,000 people. There are all sorts of weird and wonderful connotations on this, but the fact is the story still exists. There's no date, so we don't know which pharaoh it was, and therefore we don't know what century it was. There are two possibilities in scholars' minds. The first possibility is that it was in the 15th century BC, and the second possibility was in the 13th century BC. Now, in the 15th century, it was a pharaoh called Thutmose, and in the 13th century, it was Ramesses II, and this is the most popular theory. And Ramesses II is the pharaoh who there's a really famous carving of Ramesses II where you've got 4 images of Pharaoh, 2 and 2 with a small doorway in between, and they are massive, and that's basically Ramesses II. He had 4 images of himself carved in the side of a mountain, which seems impossible, the sheer scale of it. But there we are. Pharaoh is very much played down in Christian tales, and we have to remember that the Pharaoh at that time was a very, very powerful emperor, and he wielded the most military might of any known nation in the world. Then there is the dispute about the route which was taken, whether they went north or they went down the middle or they went south. All these things make people doubt whether they're reading fact or fiction. The most understandable explanation for the facts is the Bible explanation and the book of Exodus. Well, let's have a look at the facts. The existence of a nation called Israel, where did they come from if it wasn't from this? And if they weren't a bunch of slaves? We do know that there were slaves in Egypt of a Hebrew background from historical records, but we don't know where they went. Some dramatic turnaround in their fate is needed to explain how they go from being slaves in Egypt to the existence of them as the nation of Israel. Fact, every Jewish family celebrates the Passover and has done for time immemorial. There has to be some explanation for a nation, a whole nation, to all be doing the same ritual at the same time. And the book of Exodus provides the most reasonable explanation. There are some of the facts, these facts, that are indisputable. Let's run through the sections of this book. I can't go through and give you a complete commentary because we'd be here for years. I just want to give you some points which are of interest, and as with all of these talks, I'm trying to spark an interest in you and give you an overview and, for want of a better word, the keys, so that you can read it and unlock the Bible verses. So let's first look at multiplication and murder. Why did they stay so long in Egypt? 400 years. They went to Egypt at the end of Genesis with Joseph, because there was a famine. They went there voluntarily, and they spent 7 years in Goshen, which was a very good and fertile piece of land. So why didn't they go home after the famine was over? They stayed so long, they outstayed their welcome. They were forced into forced labour. So why did they stay? Well, there's a human answer and a divine answer. The human answer, they became comfortable. With Joseph as the head honcho, they would have been given all the best of everything. It was easier to make a living there. Life would have been easier there, for a start, because they didn't have any snow. The land was more fertile, the climate was warmer. It was much the same way as Lot was more comfortable down in the valley at Sodom and Gomorrah. The climate was very similar to the Nile Delta, and they were just comfortable there. God hadn't given them any land in Egypt. He'd given them the land of Canaan, and they outstayed their welcome, by which time it was too late. And they did all this without consulting God. How many Christians see a house when they wanting to move and go for it before checking out whether there are any churches in the area, whether it's good for their work circumstances, or most importantly, whether it's good by asking God whether this is the right area for them to live in. We shop with our eyes and our bellies, not by asking God if it's good for us. That's the human answer. And then, and only then, once they've had their fun and done what they wanted and not consulted God until it's too late, we do this on a daily basis. We wake up and we don't thank God for this day, and we're halfway through the day before we even speak to God, or sometimes things go wrong, and it's not a new thing. It's not a Jewish thing. It's a human trait. We get ourselves into problems and then start blaming God for it and asking him very quickly to get us out of them. And quite often that's the only time we talk to God. And that shouldn't be the case. We should be having a relationship with him. And then they cry out to God, why are you doing this to us? It's the same old story. Go your own way, and when things go wrong, it's all God's fault, and why doesn't he get you out of it? But God let them stay there for 400 years. Why? Had they gone back when the famine was over, there would have been they would have just been a few people, and there would have been room in Canaan for them. But now they had stayed so long, and they were such a large people, there was no room for them in Canaan, because there were other people that lived there. They'd been gone for 400 years. It's like leaving your house for 400 years and expecting nobody to be there when you come back. It's going to be gone. That was very squeaky. And God had explained to Abraham that his people would stay in Egypt until the wickedness of the Canaanites was complete. And he'd actually explained to Abraham how long he was going to stay there as well. He'd explained that they were going to be there for 400 years. So before God could empty the land of the Canaanites, he had to wait for them to become so bad that it would be an act of justice and judgment to throw them out of the promised land and let all the Hebrew slaves in. As they stayed in Egypt, they became bigger and bigger people. That's the reason why God chose a 400-year gap. It's a long time for God to answer your prayers. But the people kept asking God and saying, one day he'll answer our prayers. That's an amazing amount of patience to go on praying for 400 years. But God heard them, and at the right time he acted. They underwent 3 oppressive decrees from the Egyptians. Forced labour was the first. Making bricks without straw was the second. And if you make a brick without straw, it's approximately 3 times heavier than and it makes it a hell of a lot more difficult to carry. The Egyptians thought that if they did this, the Hebrews wouldn't have any energy left, basically for sex, and it would bring their numbers down. But perversely, they had more babies during this period. So they had to introduce a 3rd decree, and the Egypts decreed that they would take the firstborn baby boy and throw the baby boys into the River Nile for the crocodiles to eat, to bring the numbers down. The Nile was a source of life for Egypt, but it was a place of death for the Hebrew slaves. The bulrushes and the bush. I don't overly need to say a lot about the story of Moses, but he was like Joseph was, as in he was brought up in court. Therefore, he was given the best education, and I mean the best education. If you go to London, on the side of the Thames, there's Cleopatra's Needle, and there are 2 of these. One is in Rome and one is in London, and they would have been pillars at the front of the Egyptian university. And so Moses would have walked past these things every day when he went to school or to university. This made him far more educated than anybody else in the Hebrew nation. This is why he was able to write the 5 books of the Bible, and it says that he kept careful records of everything. He collected people's memories, stories handed down, then he put them together in 5 books. Sorry about the drilling. As I said, next door is having a new front door put in. He put them together in 5 books, and his education as an Egyptian prince was not wasted. He basically lost his temper and killed a slave driver, and he spent 40 years in the wilderness. The same wilderness as the people of Israel were going to spend 40 years in. So this was God preparing Moses for what was to come. And if you look back on your life, you'll no doubt see God preparing you for things that you had to move into. It's, as I said, I think it was last week, we quite often can't see God's hand on our lives when we're going through things. But if we look back on the process of our life, we quite often will see God's hand on our lives. And then we come to the burning bush. This is very interesting. Not so much for the bush, but for Moses' excuses. God called to Moses out of the burning bush, and he said, "Take off your shoes, you're on holy ground." And he tells Moses, "You're going to be the man that draws out my people out of Egypt." Moses was drawn out of the bulrushes, and Moses is now going to draw God's people out of Egypt. Moses makes 5 excuses why he can't do this, and why he can't do what God was asking him to do. The first one, I am insignificant. Who am I that anybody would take notice of me? And God said, I'll be with you. I am the important one, not you. How many times have we said, I'm nobody. I can't do this for you, God. I've done it. There was a circumstance a number of years ago when I had a dream and God was telling me to call all the leaders of the Neath churches together and give them a message. And I was like, I'm nobody. I'm just a youth worker at the time, and I'm not even a pastor of a church. So then a couple of years later, God makes me a pastor of a church. And I have this dream again. And I'm like, okay, they're still not going to listen to me. I'm only the pastor of a youth church. And somebody messaged me the following morning from the book of Ezekiel. And he was saying that basically if you don't give the message to my people, then on you ahead be it. But if you give them the message, then on their heads. So I took it upon myself, and no, you're quite right, Sharon. He doesn't give up. So, as I said, I called a meeting of well, I invited all the leaders of the 70 odd churches in around Neath. Only 13 of them turned up, but that's beside the point. I did it. The second thing that Moses said was, I'm ignorant. What shall I say? And God said, I'll make you promise. I'll tell you what to say. The third thing was, I am impotent. I can't convince them. They won't believe me, basically. And God says, my power will be with you. You're going to be able to do miracles. The fourth excuse was, I'm incompetent. I'm not eloquent. Basically, he had a stammer. And God says, your brother Aaron will be your prophet. And it's at this point that we find out exactly what a prophet is. A prophet is simply a mouthpiece. He should just pass a message on and leave it at that. So you tell your brother what to say, and he'll say it to Pharaoh. And that's all that a prophet should do, is just pass on a message. And the fifth excuse was, I am irrelevant. Send somebody else. Here I am. Send him. God promised Moses a partner. And now we move on to the plague and the pestilence. The 10 plagues, the Nile to blood, frogs, gnats and mosquitoes, flies, cattle disease, boils, hailstones, locusts, darkness, and eventually leading up to the death of the firstborn. Do you notice in this that God is in control of the whole insect world? just like Jonah, where Jonah is not only in control, where God is not only in control of the whale, but at the end of the story, it shows that God can control a worm. And a worm is a lot more difficult to control than a whale. But God tells a worm what to do. And if you haven't read that in Jonah, go to the end bit of Jonah and you'll know what I'm talking about. God tells mosquitoes and flies and frogs what to do. We have a tremendous sense of God's control over what he's created here. There's a build-up of intensity here also, from discomfort to disease to danger and finally to death. The plagues gradually get worse as Pharaoh and the people refuse to respond to his warnings. What many Christians miss is the religious contest that is going on here in the background. And this was a contest between gods, between the God of the Hebrews and the gods of the Egyptians. Every one of these plagues was an attack on every one of the gods worshipped by the Egyptians. That gives the plagues a real meaning. And to give you an idea, some of the gods of Egypt at the time were Khnum, the god of the guardian of the Nile, Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, Osiris, where it was seen as Osiris's bloodstream was the Nile, Heket, a frog-like god, the god of resurrection, Hathor, the mother goddess, was a cow, Apis was a bull, Manavis was a bull. It was the sacred bull of Heliopolis. Then there was a god of medicine. There was a sky goddess, a goddess of life. Seth was the protector of crops. Then they had 4 sun gods. And on top of that, Pharaoh was supposed to be divine as well. So God systematically takes out and squashes every single god of the Egyptians. It's not just a random series of events. It's not a random series of plagues. There's a divine inference here. And the message was very simple. This God of the Hebrew slaves is far more powerful than all of your gods put together. And they still didn't listen. Now, there is a strange aspect to these where Pharaoh's heart was hardened by God. This is the basis that people use for predestination. It's up to God whose heart he hardens. So God predetermines what's going to happen. It's like a fixed bingo match. And it's like God just picking names out of a hat and saving some and some going to hell. This is not the Bible teaching. And if you study, you'll find this. 10 times Pharaoh's heart was hardened, but the first 7 times Pharaoh's heart was hardened, he hardened it himself. And then God said, well, if that's the road that you're taking, I'll help you on your way. And he helped him to harden his heart the last 3 times. God only hardened Pharaoh's heart after Pharaoh had repeatedly and deliberately hardened his heart himself. And God says, if you want to go down that road, I'll help you down that road. If that's really what you want, I'll give you a push. And the book of Revelation says, let him who is filthy be filthy still. In other words, that's the route you've chosen, then God will help you down that route. But Pharaoh hardens his heart first, and then God hardens it for him the last 3 times. This is not predestination. God responds to our choices. And if we persistently choose the wrong way, God will help us along this route to demonstrate his judgment if we refuse to be a demonstration of his mercy. Then we come to the Passover, the feast and the firstborn. This has a direct correspondence to the 10 plagues. The firstborn of the family, of any family, Egyptian or Hebrew, would die unless they did something about it. What they had to do was paint blood on the doorposts and the lintel. Blood is scarlet, which is the hardest thing to see in the dark, but an angel would see it, and the angel of death would come to Egypt that night, and he would see the blood, and he would pass over that house. They had to get that blood before they could put it onto the doorposts. So where did they get it from? This meant that an innocent life had to be shed to get that blood. If they didn't put it on the doorposts, it wouldn't work. So they killed a 1-year-old ram, and a 1-year-old ram with horns is a strong animal, and a 1-year-old ram is equivalent to a 30-year-old man. And here we see the direct correlation with Christ. They put the blood on the door and took the body inside, roasted it and ate it. But they ate it standing up because they had to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. So they prepared emergency rations with them of unleavened bread, and they keep this feast every year. Every year they keep this feast, and the youngest member of the family has to say, "What does all this mean?" And the oldest member of the family has to say, "This is what God did on the night when every firstborn died, and we were saved because of the blood of the ram." Well, that's part of the way through Exodus. We'll carry on Exodus next week. I hope you've enjoyed. For Sharon, I hope that it's living up to your expectations, and because it's Sharon's favourite book. But we will carry on next week. Have a blessed week, and I love you all, and I'm really interested to hear your any thoughts or questions that you have. So post them in the comments below. God bless. See you next week. Bye.